Hi folks, this is author Hugh B. Long, author of science fiction and fantasy infused with mythology. Welcome to my podcast. The following is a chapter from my latest novella, Of Ice and Magic. The next morning, Fornulf awoke, still weary from his labors at the life forge the night before last. Creating such artifacts took concentration beyond most men, and it taxed him so. He sat down at the kitchen table beside his daughter, who was playing with an old sword of his. Despite her mother's lessons in weaving and knoll-binding, Berengaria often practiced with Fornulf's sword and spear. She entertained fantasies of becoming a Valkyrie, one of the goddess Freya's holy shield maidens, who chose the slain on the battlefield. The chosen would then go to Valhalla. He smiled. She was his baby, and he liked to indulge her. Hildegun had prepared a hearty breakfast of rye porridge and eggs for them. Fornulf watched her, admiring her beauty, the fair hair and sea-blue eyes. She was still so young. He was almost 20 years her senior. He'd never looked at another woman since he'd met Hildegund. Well, unless he counted that minor dalliance with one of the old chief's serving maids, a Welsh girl named Idel, but that had been almost 15 years ago, just after they'd arrived on the island. He and Hildegund had been blessed with two healthy, fine-looking children, Karl, their oldest, and their daughter, Berengaria. Once again, he pondered the need to find her a good husband. She was almost 16 after all. Maybe Chief Torgny would find her a good match. A minor noble, maybe. Despite having everything he'd wanted within the walls of their modest house, this morning he felt hollow. Such was the weight of knowledge of what he'd just crafted. Men would kill each other, regardless of whether Fornulf walked the world or not. But as he grew older, he thought more about his part in such things. Perhaps he felt regret. But once a man embarked on a long journey, starting over was almost impossible. His skills fed his loved ones, and that necessity outweighed his guilty conscience. Hildegund bent down to kiss her husband's head as she passed him. "Why the dour look, husband?" He looked up and kissed her chin as she shuffled away. "Oh, I'm fine. I'm taking the boy to town, Hild. We've supplies to fetch. Should be back in 2 or 3 days. "I know," Hildegund said. "Karl told me this morning." Berengaria beamed, slamming the sword down on the table, toppling a couple of goat's milk. Her long brown hair fell around her face. "May I come? I'd like to go," she nodded, enthusiastically, as if that would persuade him. "I could help," she added tentatively, ignoring the spreading pool of goat's milk on the table. Fornulf knew exactly what his daughter wanted, a chance to gossip with the other girls in town. She'd get nothing done, and what's more, he'd have to hunt her down before they left, like as not. "Not this time, Bryn." He'd given her that pet name, which meant male armor. He felt it reflected her often tough exterior. "Your mother needs help around the farm." He knew that wasn't entirely true. She could be spared for a few days. And he knew that she knew. Their farm was modest, only producing a few hardy vegetables, some meat from pigs, and milk from the goats. His smithing provided most of the family's income. But he'd raised an obedient, though spirited daughter. She knew better than to argue with him, and just scowled, stomping a foot beneath the table. Gods above, she'd be a handful for a future husband. He almost smiled at the thought. "Where's Karl?" he asked Hildegund. "Already up and out and working, love," Hildegund said. Now he did smile. He was proud of his son. Karl was obedient, attentive, and hard-working. He truly wanted to please his father and was the best apprentice Fornulf had ever had. Karl would take his mantle as a fjorsmither when Fornulf was gone, and his knowledge pleased him. Daughters were a comfort, and he loved Berengaria, but sons were so much more useful. He took a few coins from the pouch given him by Torgny and gave the rest to Hildegund for safekeeping. Hildegund hugged him goodbye, but Berengaria was still scowling as he left the house. Karl had the horses hooked up to their empty wagon and was waiting for his father. Fornulf clambered up onto the front bench with Karl giving him a little push. He was getting too old for wagons, perhaps even for the forge. Under a grey sky, every joint ached and his limbs felt like rusty iron, creaky and stiff. "You have the bow?" he asked Karl. "Yes, father," Karl said. Fornulf nodded. Trolls still roamed the lonely, windswept moors in these parts. Men had to be prepared to defend themselves when they left their homes. Every now and then, even a great worm was said to have been spotted, though Fornulf had never seen one. Hildegund stood in the doorway and waved as her men and the wagon slowly pulled away along the dirt track. Fornulf glanced back and blew her a kiss. 2 days later, their wagon full of supplies, Fornulf and Karl bumped along the dirt track to their little farmstead in the hills. Their journey had been pleasant and uneventful. "Mother will be so pleased with the Frankish fabric you bought her, father," Karl said. "I hope so. It's been long enough since we've had extra for silver for any finery. Perhaps your sister will speak to me again after I present her with the silk." Karl grinned. "Don't get your hopes up, father. Now, if you'd bought her a nice spear or maybe a bow, then maybe." "True enough," Fornulf chuckled. "Father, look," Karl said, pointing in the distance toward their farm. "Smoke!" Fornulf slapped the reins on the rumps of the two horses, and their wagon surged forward as much as it could under the weight of their full load. Karl snatched the bow from beneath the wagon seat and strung it hastily. Fornulf had a bellyful of snakes as they neared the farm. He spied flames licking low clouds and smoke billowing from his house and small barns. Many of the buildings had burned down already, indicating that the fire had been burning for hours. He stumbled out of the wagon, falling into the muddy lane. Karl pulled him up, and together they ran to the remains of the home's threshold. Fornulf fell to his knees and sobbed, such as he'd not done since his previous wife and children had been taken by the plague. "Father!" came Karl's voice again. Fornulf turned to see his son kneeling beside their stone well. He ran to his son. Lying there, bloody, battered, dress torn top and bottom, was his dearest Hildegund. Once again he fell to his knees, sobbing. He threw his body over hers and whispered, "I am so sorry, love. So sorry." He startled when she opened her eyes. Her face was covered in dirt and soot and caked with dried blood. She tried to speak, but her lips were broken, her teeth shattered. A clearly mortal wound wept blood from her belly. "Who did this?" he asked. She began. "Torgny?" he asked. She battered her eyelids. "Bryn?" he asked. "Did they take her?" She shuddered with pain as she shook her head. "Where is she?" he asked. A single tear washed the soot and dirt from a track along her cheek, and her eyes set like the evening sun. Fornulf held his beautiful Hild as she faded, departing her mortal coil. Fornulf worshipped the old gods, but Hildegund had been a Christian, as were his children, and so he'd fashioned a cross for her, planting it near the head of her grave, which they dug on top of a small hill overlooking the bay. Karl spoke words to help send his mother on her way. The sun was easing into the sea as they paid their final respects. No more tears flowed from Fornulf's eyes that day. Sorrow yielded to cold rage. His revenge would be like the great icebergs that floated up in the fjords in the spring, slow and inexorable. He would end Chief Torgny. He swore it to the old gods and the new. Something caught his eye, and Fornulf stared down the hill. A shadow moved against the setting sun. He ambled down the hill, and soon enough he could make out a figure. A girl. "Father?" Berengar asked. "Bryn!" Fornulf hobbled as quickly as his leg allowed and scooped up his daughter. "Gods above, child, I thought you were taken or killed." She shook her head ruefully, eyes red from crying. She was muddy and pitiful, but whole. Fornulf caressed her dirty cheeks and stroked her hair. "When Mother saw the men coming," Berengar said, "I guess she had a bad feeling. She told me to run. I didn't understand, but I knew she was serious. I lay on my stomach just over the hill and watched the men. That skinny one, the one they called Kraka, he got off his horse first and spoke to Mother. I couldn't hear what was said, but then he struck her, really hard, knocked her to the ground, and then the other men went into the house and barns. I was afraid, Father." "It's all right, Bryn. You were a good girl to do what your mother told you." "I went and hid in the cave, but I wasn't sure when to come out." Berengar sobbed as her father held her tight. "I heard screaming," she managed between sobs. "I'll avenge her," Karl said, still staring at his mother's grave. "You will not," Fornulf said evenly. "I've lost enough this day." "Please, Karl, no," Berengar pleaded. Fornulf turned slowly to his son. "Do you not think I grieve the loss of your mother? Would that I could storm in and kill his entire household, then so I would. But I am no warrior, and neither are you. I could kill him, Carl said sourly. Perhaps. But could you then kill all his men as well? For they would surely kill you, and I would have lost another member of my family. It saddened Fornulf that his son, with such a gentle soul, should be driven to such fury. Berengaria had always been the child with the warrior's heart, but not Carl. Carl stormed off, cursing and kicking up chunks of sod. Fornulf understood the boy's fury and impatience, but he'd lived 51 winters. He'd seen men hurry to avenge slain family, only to swiftly join them in the afterlife. No, his revenge would have to be slow, deliberate. He knew his strengths and weaknesses. He was no warrior, nor was Carl, though he might be young and fit. It took years to learn how to wield a sword properly, years which Torgny and his men had spent diligently. Firstly, he needed to understand why Torgny had done this, and to do that, he had to live, which meant he had to leave the farmstead. Clearly Torgny had been intent on killing him, but hadn't found him at home. But why? Why would he do this? And if Torgny meant to kill him, then surely this was far from over. There was little of value left after the fire. Even the remaining gold he'd received from Torgny had been taken. They salvaged what supplies they could, took what they could carry from the wagon, and then made for the mountains. Fornulf wished he had a living sword with him, but all he carried was a trusty spear. A solid weapon, to be sure, but with no special abilities, except that which came from regular use of the whetstone. Carl carried an old sword and Fornulf's hunting bow. Fornulf and his 2 children talked as they trudged up the hill path. We'll seek refuge until I can define the reason for Torgny's crime. We'll find some way to avenge your mother, Fornulf said. Does it matter why he did it? The bastard murdered her, Carl objected. Son, if we understand the reason, then perhaps we'll be in a better position to succeed. Do you remember what I taught you about forging? Carl nodded silently. Good. Then you know it matters why the iron hardens. If you know the why, then you can repeat the process or change it. The why is everything. If you know that, then you have the keys to the kingdom, lad. You must understand the motivation of your enemies. You sound like a warrior, Carl said. Do you think I was always a smith? Carl turned to look at his father with a look of incredulity. You, a warrior? Carl grinned. You find that so hard to fathom? Father, I mean no offense, but you have always been such a peaceful man, and you were born lame. He glanced down at his father's hobbled leg. Fornulf gave his son a rueful smile. In fact, I was not born like this. But you told us, Berengaria objected. I told you a story, children, because I did not want Carl to run off to the shield wall and die, as I nearly did. Carl stopped talking suddenly, looking at his father with disbelief. Fornulf hiked up his right trouser leg and revealed a long scar which ran horizontally across his shin. It was almost a full crescent, only sparing the back half of his leg. I told you this was a mishap of birth. Does that not look suspiciously straight? Carl nodded. I see. In my first shield wall, when I was but your age, some clever bastard struck beneath my shield and nearly took my leg clean off with the flick of a wrist. My leg hung on only by the rearmost skin and flesh, the bone having been cloven nearly in 2. I suppose that was my salvation, for it healed, thanks to some old crone wise in the ways of leechcraft, though it left me lame for many years, and I still suffer its effect 35 years on. Later that year, I heard the story of the man who'd wounded me. They said he wielded an enchanted sword made by the legendary fjorsmither, the life forger, Ulfbert, which was why, with one easy blow, he'd nearly taken my leg. That wound left me with a nasty limp thereafter, and the leg was weak, so I could no longer become the warrior I'd hoped. The story planted a peculiar seed in me. I began to marvel at a blade crafted so finely, and of course I had to find some way to earn my way in the world, so I spent the next 4 years searching for that smith in the desperate hope of learning that eldritch art. Truly? Carl asked, astonished. Fornulf nodded. So yes, I know something of war, though not overly much, I admit. But I never wanted that for you, Carl. I saw how easily those highborn spent young men's lives like chunks of hack silver. No, I knew I could do better for you. And so, in order not to encourage any dreams of heroics, I said I'd been born lame, and kept my shameful battle to myself." "But, father, why would you forge blades like the one that nearly killed you?" Berengar asked. "You should have killed that old bastard, father," Carl added. Fornulf shrugged. "I admit the thought crossed my mind, though only for a moment. No, I realized that men would continue to kill men whether or not Ulfberht crafted swords, and I was very fortunate, for Ulfberht's apprentice had just died of the fever, so he took me on." They resumed their climb up the hill. Berengar snatched the hunting bow from Carl's hands and motioned with her hand for the quiver of arrows. "You know I'm a better shot, Carl." He scowled. "You think you are." He handed her the quiver and shook his head. "Where will we go, father?" she asked. "First, we'll seek sanctuary with an old friend." Thanks for listening to my podcast. If you want more free stories in audiobook or ebook form, head over to my website and subscribe for updates at www.hughblong.com. I'll also be offering subscribers other benefits like advance access to my novels and short stories, original artwork, and the ability to participate in my beta reading program. Thanks again.